Fifth generation warfare is being weaponized and used against you. It's being used against me and you. It's against us. And if that sounds scary, it certainly is. And I am having an amazing conversation with Dr. Robert Malone, one of the best conversations I have had. And we're going to talk about what this fifth generation warfare is, how it's gone from first, second, third, fourth, and fifth, how it's being weaponized against us, how the intelligence community is using things such as limited hangouts, Five Eyes Consortium, the Trusted News Initiative, of course, WEF, Davos, the WHO, how they're all involved. This is an amazing conversation with someone who has massive amounts of experience in this specifically. Now, I do have to tell you that, unfortunately, because this is going on YouTube, not everything we were talking about is able to go onto YouTube, unless I want my channel shut down, which of course I don't. So this is somewhat redacted, heavily redacted in some spots. And so if you want the full interview, which I would recommend, you can go check it out on my podcast. We'll link it down below. But let's go ahead and just jump into this conversation with Dr. Robert Malone. Dr. Malone, thank you so much for joining me today. It's a pleasure to have you in the studio, and I can't wait to dig in. You're looking great in your brand new studio. So, I've been following your work for a long time. Big fan of your work. I really like the approach. It's a common sense approach that should appeal to most people. I know you're kind of one of those. You got thrust into the limelight, I think, through Joe Rogan, and then you got censored and you got deleted, deplatformed. And so you've kind of been at the forefront of this. And so I've been following your journey. Your Substack has been great. We'll link to that Substack down below. Obviously, you're a doctor, right? I think I listened to you in some other interviews where you talked about your extensive career and the work that you've done. And I believe that you said you maybe had interfaced with some intelligence communities in the past. Maybe touch on that if you have some experience in that.
Yeah, so you cannot be in biodefense without having touch points with the intelligence community. They are all through and through it. The tech that was involved in these products, injectable products that we are all familiar with, was advanced. DARPA is the functional arm for product development and new technology advancement of the CIA. That's what they do. They developed the SR-71. They actually did invent the internet. And they have an investment arm called InQtel, which is funding a lot of the build-out around this new product technology. I was brought into this bizarre world of biodefense at a key point in time when it kind of really gelled. And that was after the anthrax attacks in '01, as well as the towers coming down. And I had just launched, I'd been an academic and an academic entrepreneur, and had just launched a new company using Norwegian capital called Inovio that was using a different delivery technology than the positively charged fat technology that we know of with these current products. And planes hit the towers, the investors pulled back. They thought it was not a good time to be investing in the United States, and I was left high and dry. And took a job with a company that had just acquired the contract for all biodefense products for the U.S. military for what we call advanced development, which is taking it through clinical trials to licensure. So I worked there as an associate clinical director, which means that I basically had my hands in every type of product, drugs, antibodies in the pipeline for development by the U.S. Army. And that at that time was very much integrated into the intelligence community. The intelligence community is basically set into most of the leadership roles all through the biodefense enterprise. And prior to that, remember, the biodefense enterprise as it exists right now used to be the biowarfare enterprise. Just a fun little fact, the U.S. government probably spent, well, the argument is made that the U.S. government has spent much more money on biowarfare than it has spent on nuclear warfare. Much of the modern infrastructure of biology as we know it is really the consequence of massive spending by the U.S. government in biowarfare and biowarfare technology. These are all things that I was unaware of at the time. I went into that position as clinical director and then pivoted to really changing my whole career thrust, getting out of academic discovery research because it was just writing papers. You weren't ending up making products, and focusing on advanced development. And over time, at one point, I ended up with a business partner who was a retired CIA agent and retired U.S. Army colonel who had been in charge of some of the major biodefense programs for the DoD. And he introduced me to a variety of other people that were in the intelligence community, CIA or otherwise. And this includes Michael Callahan, who is arguably our top expert, I now know, because of Whitney Webb's reporting. Her article about Michael, titled "DARPA's Man in Wuhan," is a classic. I had no idea of what Michael's long history was. He's just I just knew him as a brilliant scientist, physician who had deep knowledge and expertise and connections in the biodefense industry. I only later came to understand what his role was in gain-of-function research and all the things that relate to the current threat. I also knew that he was advisor to multiple presidents and that he was dropped into a variety of hot zones over time. And I first really worked with him during the Ebola outbreak, where he was stationed in Africa and at the forefront of pushing forward a variety of new therapeutic products, including antibody products, and, as I recall, testing remdesivir initially. And from Michael and my old business partner, I met other people that are throughout this network, one of whom is currently the director of the international organization called CEPI. So I've continued until the last 3 years, and really about when I started speaking out, when I went on Brett Weinstein's podcast, it was actually the big transformational moment. I continued to work closely with the Department of Defense, really at the intersection of industry and the government, and became quite a specialist in solving complex problems for the government, and assembling teams and getting them funded to move projects forward, typically in the biodefense space, but also in other biologic products. So there's a short summary of my touch points.
Yeah.
I'm not CIA, I'm not trained CIA.
Yeah, that's great.
But I've dealt with these folks quite a bit and learned how to navigate a world in which many of the players are trained liars. And in order to do that, you have to be really adroit at discerning the tactics that are used, like limited hangouts and like redirection and all the other strategies that they use to obscure truth and redirect you away from things that they really don't want you to know about.
That's great. And so you've been around, you've navigated through this, you've worked closely with them, and I think also, I mean, you're an academic and you're a clinical researcher, you've written extensively, and so all of those skills also allow you to kind of dig into the data, parse through the data, make sense of it, and then write about it, which I think all also leads into what you're doing today, which I think is great. And it explains why your articles that you've been putting out are so good, because that's what you've been doing for so long. So I appreciate that. But there's something that really caught my eye that I want to kind of dig into. And it's something that I think everybody feels. Maybe they don't see it, but they feel it. And again, you were sort of a victim of this. And it's something that I've been talking about for a long time, where I believe that the next war isn't maybe a hot or kinetic war, it's a war of information. And so you've been talking about something called the fifth generation of warfare, which kind of echoes kind of like what I was saying. I hadn't really thought about it in those terms. So let's start on that. Would you define what this fifth generation warfare is? So it's not my name, by the way. It's some people get confused about that. I just want to be clear. And General Flynn has a new little paperback out that's really small that you can order, easy to get through, written for common layperson language. And there's also a great summary that's more academic, quite a bit longer, that you can get as an ebook on Amazon called 5GW. And a lot of people get confused
5GW has nothing to do with cell towers. It's just an abbreviation for fifth generation warfare. It's a misnomer to call it a generation of war. It's really a gradient of war. And you can think of, for instance, first gen, or that first gradient, being swords and knives and combat on horses, and you have battle lines, spears, that kind of stuff. And you have centralized control, and you're battling over territory. Second generation is essentially the Civil War in the United States through the First World War, where you had kinetic weapons, battle lines, you still had central command, you were still fighting over territory, and you have propaganda. But the propaganda is not the main thrust of the warfare activities. Third gen war can be thought of as the innovation of the Germans in the Blitzkrieg. One of the key things the Germans did, and people often are not aware, the Maginot Line in France was actually superior technically to the German Blitzkrieg forces. But what the Germans had was they allowed tactical flexibility at the commander level. So you had general strategy coming from above, but you had tactical flexibility in the field. Think Rommel. So that's kind of a key characteristic of third-gen warfare, is you still have propaganda. For instance, the Ghost Army, which is still one of the main psyops propaganda divisions of the U.S. Army based in Fort Bragg, about 800 soldiers. Derived from that. So we had the Ghost Army deployed to distract the Germans from the landing in Normandy. That was the inflatable tanks, and there was recordings of artillery movements and those kinds of things that were used as part of that psyops. Fourth gen is basically what has been developed in response to the fact that we now have superpowers, and really one dominant superpower currently. And so it's a strategy developed for asymmetric warfare in Syria, in Afghanistan with the Taliban, and of course Al-Qaeda as examples, great examples of fourth-gen warfare. I don't think the U.S. Army has won a single fourth-gen conflict. In fourth-gen warfare, you have even more of a presence of propaganda, and the goals are still tactical control of territory. But there's an increasing thrust on propaganda and the penetration of a population with ideas and use of psyops and information to convince a population that they should go along with the purposes of the aggressors, or in the case of the asymmetric conflict, in the case of the guerrillas, etc. But they're still battling over territory. Al-Qaeda was an interesting situation because with the death of Osama bin Laden, you lost that central control. And what happened was that Al-Qaeda devolved or evolved into a completely decentralized force. So you had completely autonomous cells all over the world acting based on general strategic objectives that were coming from some vague leadership. But each was fully autonomous, and basically they had the message, kill Americans wherever you can. We had roadside bombs, all these kinds of things, our fifth-gen warfare engagements. And you couldn't really see the Army, U.S. Army, the U.S. military, the U.S. intelligence community couldn't really tell what was the center of Al-Qaeda because there was no center. It was whack-a-mole. They would put down this little cell or that little cell, but it wouldn't extinguish the total activity.
Let's take a break on the fifth gen for a second. Just let me ask a couple questions on the fourth gen. So the fourth gen really kind of went where third generation was like, hey, we have the battlefield, we know who the opponents, and we know who's at war here. The battle lines are drawn. Fourth gen then kind of went into this guerrilla type warfare. You mentioned the Viet Cong, so that's kind of where we started seeing this guerrilla warfare, which then kind of led into the terrorism. The war on terror. Is that correct, if I frame it up that way?
Yeah, that's a fair construction, and you're right. The war on terror is part of the justification for the further development of the technology we now call fifth gen. And in fifth gen, we start to incorporate in a real significant way all kinds of other operational technology as opposed to kinetic weapons. So this involves, for instance, biowarfare increasingly, psyops, of course, algorithmic control, information war of a variety of different types, including computational, aggressive actions against computer networks, and economic warfare, etc. Go ahead.
Yeah. I remember I remember thinking, obviously we have the famous President Eisenhower on his way out warning us about this military-industrial complex, which I think you have a different viewpoint on. We'll get to that later. But when we had these wars, we had the Cold War ended, and then we had, this kind of period of peace, maybe from 1990 to 2000, like this 10-year period of peace. And probably Raytheon and Northrop Grumman, they're all sitting around like, well, what are we going to do now, right? And like we had this opponent, the USSR, this opponent. And when it was gone, then what does the military-industrial complex do? And so then it seemed like to me, and I remember going back, 20, however long ago it was, 30 years ago, and it was like, well, what if we have this opponent, we have this war with a nameless, faceless group that can't be identified? We don't know who they are, where they are. We really have no way to beat them. And so it's like we almost have like the perfect opponent for the military-industrial complex, one that can't ever be identified or beat. And I remember thinking that back then. And that's kind of what I guess kind of fits into this, right? And actually kind of goes into this fifth.
It absolutely does, and that's a good way to frame it. That's perhaps the little more edgy, paranoid conspiracy theory version, but there's merit to it. Just because it is you're perceiving a conspiracy doesn't mean that one doesn't exist. I agree that it is very convenient. It has defined virtually the entire world's population as potential hostiles, and all of us as combatants. That's another one of the key characteristics of 5G, is that there is no distinction between military combatants and non-military combatants. We are all in the war. There are no boundaries. There are no rules of engagement. There are no ethics. There's nothing that's off limits. Anything goes, and it's all about control. The battlefield in 5G, this is a huge difference. The battlefield in 5G is no longer for physical territory. It is for your mind, your thoughts, your emotions, the knowledge that you have. That is the landscape, and it is totally utilitarian. The ends justify the means. Anything goes. Lying is okay. Misrepresenting, it's all for the cause. Anything is justified.
And of course that makes sense because we live in an information world today, right? And so the war is over information, not so much physical territory. What is the limited hangout?
Oh.
You mentioned that a couple times. I'm not sure what that is.
Yeah. So we first all learned this intelligence community language from Tricky Dick Nixon, when on the tapes he discussed the modified limited hangout with Haldeman and Ehrlichman, which was kind of a fallback position. So the concept of limited hangout, this is a well understood term in the intelligence community. And you can see it, once you understand what it is, you can see it being used all the time. Often in Politico articles, for some reason, Politico seems to have a direct pipeline to, let's say, intelligence community thought leaders. What it is that when the evidence or the information about a topic area that you're not supposed to be knowing or talking about becomes overwhelming, and it's sufficiently public that it can't be denied, then what's done is typically to put out stories in which some of that information is disclosed in an official source as real. And what happens when this is done, everybody says, good heavens, look, they've finally acknowledged these things that we've all known and they've been telling us were conspiracy theories. Remember, the phrase conspiracy theorist was injected into the popular dialogue by the CIA as a way to cover up what happened with the Kennedy assassination. That's when it entered the dialogue in United States media. So what's done is to put out a story that has enough information that's largely already known with some other information, but it distracts you from the real thing that's left that they don't want you to focus on. There was
Like sort of like a half truth where you kind of throw out a little bit of bait, enough for them to bite on, and then they kind of overlook all the rest.
Just so, and it's a distraction technology. And there's a number of others that are like this. One of the things, some of them, one of them in particular is captured in the common comment, when you're over the target is when the flak is hardest. You can think of it as if topic areas that they don't want you to talk about or discuss are surrounded by an electric fence. And as soon as you get close to those topics, you'll get a shock. You'll get fact-checked. There'll be a nasty article written about you. Whatever the thing is, you'll get censored. Those are all indicators that you can use to tell where there's topic areas that are highly sensitive. One of those, for instance, recently is Nord Stream 1 and 2 and the Seymour Hersh article that was put out, in which Seymour Hersh finally said the obvious that everybody has been talking about and acknowledging, but no one has felt it was okay to actually say, regarding the role of the United States in blowing up this gas supply for Europe and truly setting Europe into a dark winter. That was forbidden to be discussed, and yet the president himself had basically said we were going to do this if Russians invade Ukraine. Right. And they did it, but then they acted, and in all the press it was forbidden to even discuss it.
So we have this situation, to your point, conspiracy theory kind of thrust into the mainstream during the JFK situation, which, by the way, conspiracy is real. Sam Bankman-Fried, the founder of FTX Exchange, just got an additional, yesterday I believe it was like 12 additional counts of conspiracy charge. Yeah. So it's actually a thing, and it's actually illegal, and so it does happen. And then we have these half-truths, these limited hangouts coming out. And then we have the constant lying and the constant gaslighting, which is called, to your book, is called Lies My Government Told Me. And so we have that. So the lies, the half-truths, and then you add in the censorship, the electric fence, so to speak. And what is that going to do to us mentally? Of course, we're going to lead to wild speculation, right? Like, truth is found through open, honest dialogue. And so there's a saying, it says...
and that's also how trust is developed.
And trust, exactly how trust is. There's a saying that ripping out a man's tongue doesn't prove him wrong. It only proves you have something to hide. So when they shut down the conversation, well, what do you not want me to know? And instantly we think about that, right?
Let's think about the meaning of the term sovereignty, which is often key in many of our communities. Many of us think and value and cherish our sovereignty, our individual sovereignty, our sovereignty as a nation state. What is the meaning of the term sovereignty? Does it even have any meaning in a world in which you're having highly advanced psyops technology deployed on you to control what you think, what you believe, what you feel? Your mind is no longer your temple. You have no autonomy. You have no sovereignty. The concept becomes anachronistic. It's completely obsolete in a world in which every single thing is weaponized.
Yeah, that's true. I like to think of the word sovereignty as me being able to direct my life as I see fit. But to your point, if we can't control our own minds, if they're constantly feeding us, brainwashing us, propagandizing us, then maybe I don't even know how to direct my life that way because I'm probably directing my life in a way they want me to go.
Yeah, and this is what makes the 5GW, the fifth generation warfare battlescape, so torturous. Is because everything is moving and shifting. You can't be confident in anything that's under your feet. There is no solid ground. Everything is totally flexible. You have no underpinnings that you can really latch onto. Everything is fluid and plastic, and you have these various strategies, particularly as you step into social media, where I assert, for instance, Twitter, all of these social media applications are weapons, and they're also battlescapes. That Twitter is both a battleground and a weapon. It's not really so much a business. I think Elon Musk is grappling with that fact right now. And it's actively used to control, in a variety of ways, everything that you think and do if you're engaging on it. There's a saying, the only way to win in fifth-generation warfare is not to play. As soon as you engage in any of the public sphere now, whether it's just listening to CNN or engaging actively on TikTok, you are involved in a battlefield where everything is carefully crafted and managed. So the Wayback Machine has agreements now with the U.S. government that they will pull things off that are sensitive, according to the U.S. government. Absolutely.
Wow.
And
So
that's been going on quite a while.
machine.
It happened with the Hunter Biden laptop. And after it was determined that the Hunter Biden laptop story was Russian disinformation, all of those stories from the New York Post, et cetera, were scrubbed from the Wayback Machine. And then when it became public knowledge that it was, in fact, what it was purported to be, it was a genuine artifact, then the Wayback Machine got caught putting those stories back in. That is power, to completely control the information stream and counteract it in almost real time. That's fifth-gen warfare. And there's no way that you can trace who was responsible for that. Was that MI5? Was that Pfizer? Was that the U.S. government? There's no way to know. Another key aspect of this is, if you think about it, what have been the most authoritarian responses in terms of nation states? Which ones seem to have been the harshest? Well, I argue that it's the Five Eyes nations. This large international, one of the longest lasting and most powerful intelligence consortia in the history of the world, which is Great Britain, U.S., Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. All of these countries have reciprocal agreements wherein, for instance, the CIA can do stuff to British citizens that the MI5 can't. MI5 can do things to American citizens that CIA can't. And, for instance, it appears that a lot of the edits on Wikipedia that have been so aggressively promoted, just not to myself, but to many others, are all coming from a sock puppet called Philip Cross. Philip Cross somehow posts 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, and modifies Wikipedia sites with that schedule, and has been linked directly back to MI5. That's what we're dealing with. In the UK, it's the 77th Brigade, which has a member of parliament. In the US, we have multiple psyops teams from the US Army, and we have FOIA documents now that have been in the lay press from Australia, and absolutely quite a few from Canada and the UK, including from the nudge unit, quote unquote, from the UK.
Wow, this goes deep. This goes really deep. And I think it's easy for people to see. And back to that, I mean, I think just today I even saw another article pop up where Pfizer is saying that we didn't do that sort of a thing. And then also James O'Keefe all of a sudden found himself ousted from the company that he founded.
I think we're a long way from getting to the bottom of that story. And that was a great lesson in another key thing that entrepreneurs need to keep in mind is your board, particularly for nonprofits, is a very dangerous thing. And if you don't control that board rigorously, you're at risk. And that risk seems to manifest most often when there's a sudden period of achievement. It's very paradoxical, but you see it again and again and again with these nonprofits.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So, you've made this bigger and even maybe more scary than I had even originally thought. And
well, we haven't even talked about the Trusted News Initiative, which is controlled.
All right. Let's talk about the Trusted News Initiative then.
So the TNI was my first insight, and some have credited me with being the one that really brought it to common attention. Trusted News Initiative was set up in theory to counter Russian disinformation intrusion into elections. Remember, all of this propaganda and psyops was gamed out in Event 201 at Johns Hopkins in what's a well-known CIA spook shop in a series of war games that were sponsored by, here I should hit the rim shot on my Roadcaster, sponsored by Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the World Economic Forum. And they basically pre-gamed out all of this stuff, the propaganda strategies, the authoritarian responses, all based on the thesis that we would have a highly lethal pathogen. But the Trusted News Initiative was transformed from election integrity, and it is functionally a trade organization for big tech, as well as for all corporate media. So they all belong to it. Agency France Presse, Google, Yahoo, everything, they all belong to this organization. And it's laid out a series of rules in which anything, they're the ones that originate the logic that if somebody is speaking things which are different from the truth being spoken by the World Health Organization or your regional health authority, in our case here in the United States, that would be the CDC. So if you said anything that's different from what the WHO or the CDC says about any kind of a public health, then you're deemed as a spreader of mis or disinformation, which of course now our Department of Homeland Security so kindly has defined as domestic terrorism. So if you're saying things which are different from what the WHO or the CDC says, you are defined now by our Department of Homeland Security as a spreader, as a domestic terrorist. And the Trusted News Initiative rules are that anybody who is saying such things should be censored, deplatformed, etc. But they allow a little backdoor. Members of the TNI are allowed to write articles that cross those lines, but they're not allowed to syndicate them. So the Washington Post or the New York Times can come out with a single article like the New York Times did last spring, in which it said the CDC has become a politicized arm of the White House and has been withholding information from healthcare providers about the disease and the prophylactic medical product. And that was okay, but it was not okay for the Washington Post to republish it or the Des Moines Journal or anything like that, as they usually have done in the past. So that's the TNI. And then I can tell you that in the UK, I was just there again 2 weekends ago, and GB News is really scared right now. I think it's Mark Stein that got booted out. And that is the consequence. They have basically a censorship board that is semi-autonomous from the government. Used to be part of the BBC, but it's been spun out. And basically, they determine what you can say and what you can't say. And if you say things that the government or this board doesn't want you to say, then you will be disallowed from broadcasting. You'll lose your broadcasting license, or those that say these things will be fired. And so what this results in is kind of a forward-looking self-censorship. Everybody becomes afraid because they don't really know where the boundaries are, but they darn well know that they don't want to get deplatformed. Then the other thing that's going on in all of this that gets overlooked by everybody, I was listening to a lecture from the founder of the Babylon Bee, and he really wasn't even thinking about it, is that advertising has been completely weaponized. It's weaponized through the GARM agreement and AdSense. So this is how Google completely controls content, is you cannot get advertising dollars for your podcast or your broadcast unless you comply with the terms and conditions of the GARM agreement, which includes many of these same terms and restrictions in terms of what information can be discussed or not discussed. This is why YouTube has the guardrails that it has, is they accept advertising that's come through the AdSense channel. And if you breach the terms of the GARM agreement and breach the terms of the AdSense agreements, then you will lose your advertising dollars. They will be withdrawn by algorithm. That's what you're running into. That's why you're seeing these behaviors. And the consequence, of course, is that conservative broadcasts find themselves selling coffee, structured water, and pillows, whereas you would think that, for instance, many conservatives are quite well off, and you would be seeing ads for Porsches, Mercedes, and everything else in the consumer world. Conservatives buy consumer goods also, but it's the GARM agreement and AdSense that prevents that.
Interesting. And obviously, as I already said, but being a YouTube creator, I'm certainly well aware of that and those guardrails. So again, even more now, you've really expanded this situation, and it sounds pretty dire. I can understand this fifth generation warfare too, and one of the key pieces that I kind of picked up on is that you don't know where it's coming from, who's doing it, or even why. So you feel it, you know something's not right, you're not exactly sure why.
So those are key tactical and strategic objectives in 5GW. Is there is no central leadership that's readily identified. It's a low energy combat, unlike, say, kinetic weapons. There's no F-18s or M1 tanks. Low energy conflict in which ideally you have no awareness even that these ideas are being thrust into your thought space. And you have no concept of who's doing it or why. So who is the puppet master behind the various manipulations that we can all see?
Another thing you had talked about was this swarm consensus and how it operates at this level of like this virtual caste system. And I think basically what this swarm consensus is that, again, and maybe kind of pours into this point, which is we don't know who it is. And so now like this swarm consensus, well, everybody's saying it. We don't know where it originated. And so then we're not able to like point blame to somebody. Is that part of what that is?
Well, that's certainly one of the aspects as it relates to organizational structures and emerging opinions and consensus in decision-making in much of American industry, and in particular in social media and places like Twitter, where in the case of the Twitter censorship in many cases, you can't really identify, you can't pinpoint where that's coming from. And in the case of corporate media, you don't necessarily have the director of the CIA telling each journalist what they should do, or some functionary from Department of Homeland Security messaging them, but rather you have these soft indirect pressures, and then this kind of swarm emerging belief system that'll come out within particularly certain elites that have a tendency to talk to each other all the time, which is absolutely the case in modern journalism. With corporate media, we've come to the point where most of the people involved in corporate media have gone to elite schools like Columbia, and they basically have very similar backgrounds. They're often coming from a bi-coastal environment. Those are the ones that go into this kind of media. And they have a tendency to all agree with each other and talk to each other and believe that the bubble that they exist in represents reality. Right. This blends straight into the logic of the virtuals versus the physicals. Which is that we have particularly a new generation coming up that has grown up in a world in which virtual reality, both in a tangible sense and indirectly, is the norm, where the belief is that you are whatever you choose to be. Reality is whatever you choose it to be. This manifests in things like the trans movement, or furries, to take it an extreme example. You can be whatever you want to be.
To stop you on that, I'm in California, and you can imagine, obviously, we're trying to lead the country and the world in progressivism. And in the town next to me, they're putting litter boxes in the schools. So for anybody that heard him say that, furries, now you know what we're talking about. They're literally, the teachers are putting those into the students' bathrooms. And so we saw in Baltimore, kids can't pass, not one single student could pass math. In Chicago, 55 schools, not one single student could pass math or reading, but they have litter boxes.
And so I remember when I was a student, and there was a lot of discussion about cultural relativism, which is kind of a big part of what we're talking about. It was purported, it was kind of advanced that cultural relativism was all fine and good, but there were some boundaries. There were points at which things would just go too far if you were to accept, everything as being culturally relative. And the boundary that was most often cited was the African practice of clitorectomy, female genital mutilation. That was clearly a branch too far. We couldn't possibly allow that. That transgressed on women's rights and should not be allowed. But what we have right now with the gender reassignment surgery makes clitorectomy look like child's play.
So the swarm, I've kind of talked about it like this, like who are they? Kind of like this birds of a feather flock together, right? So like if you look at birds flying in formation, it wasn't like they sat down and planned that out. Like Larry, you over there, and Bob, you over there. Like the birds just kind of like happened to flock together. And so kind of to the point you're saying, like they all went to the same schools, they've all read the same books, and so they all just sort of seem to kind of swarm or kind of move together.
And they've come out of bicoastal urban environments largely. So they've had very similar cultural experiences.
Yeah.
You're not seeing, this is one of the reasons why that book by the gentleman that had grown up in, I forget what it was, Arkansas, where he was talking about a lot of the issues having to do with rural America. This is around the last presidential election, and it got so much traction. There are hardly any voices that are not coming from bicoastal urban elites in corporate media right now, which is probably one reason why corporate media is failing as a business model. And
Yeah.
this diverse menu of podcasters and other alternative media sources are becoming the norm. It allows people to connect with broadcasters and opinions that are far more diverse and that represent things more akin to what their belief systems are and their experiences are.
At the time of this recording, there's new reports that the Biden administration is laying down the United States sovereignty to the WHO for all pandemic response, including not just the response, but including controlling mis and disinformation during that pandemic response. Apparently, some Republicans are trying to mount a charge to push back on that. It doesn't appear that they may have the legal authority to do that. What's your take on that?
So one of the leading Republicans in that you're referring to is Ron Johnson, who's a friend, and I was corresponding with him yesterday about this. He's still trying to get to the bottom and actually asked my help to try to sort out what exactly is the current status of the international health regulations that are being advanced at the World Health Organization right now, and that supposedly they're going to have a meeting, I think, on February 27th to discuss. So the international health regulations have been put in place for years and years and years, and the White House asserts that they are not a treaty, and that the White House, the executive branch, is well within its rights to agree to modifications to those that would be binding, but would not require Senate approval, which, like the Constitution, is required for any treaty that's engaged in. So the White House appears to be very actively deploying a strategy to circumvent Senate authority, constitutional authority, in order to enable these modifications that would absolutely cede sovereignty, national sovereignty, to this world organization that you'll recall Mr. Trump pulled us out of, and that many people, I think with good justification, assert is largely controlled these days by the CCP and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Those are major funders, and
Yeah, the U.S. is the number one funder, and the Bill and Melinda Foundation is the second largest funder for the WHO.
And Tedros appears to have been put in place by Bill and Melinda Gates and by the CCP. These IHRs, International Health Regulations, were first floated, I think, last February, so a full year ago, by US HHS, and they were blocked by a consortium of African states and Brazil under its old leadership. Lula's different now, but the objection was the loss of sovereignty under these IHRs, in which Tedros would be able to, the Director General of the WHO, would be able to declare a public health emergency for any topic he wishes, and then mandate what the actions should be taken by a nation state. So there would be centralized mandates or edicts from WHO as to what the response should be in a nation state to the declared public health emergency. And if a nation state did not comply, the proposal is that the World Trade Organization would become the enforcement arm, because World Health Organization doesn't have any armies or enforcement arms. And so if you did not comply with the mandates from the WHO, then you would be subject to economic sanctions through the World Trade Organization. So that's the mechanism that's being proposed. And we got a kind of a foreshadowing of how the mechanics would work with the monkeypox outbreak, when the oversight panel, the advisory panel to Mr. Tedros, first voted strongly against declaring that a world health emergency. Then it was reorganized. Additional members were appointed that were more friendly towards the LGBTQ agenda, let's say, and were considered to be more specialized in their knowledge about monkeypox and that population, those patients. And once again, they met and voted 9-6 against declaring it a public health emergency, which Mr. Tedros declared was a tie, and that he had to break the tie, which he did by declaring it a public health emergency. So under these IHRs that we originally proposed now have been modified, but even Ron Johnson isn't quite sure what the modifications are. And you mentioned other Republicans. There's 17 senators that have signed off on that is all to the bill to keep the White House from basically ceding our sovereignty to Tedros. But under these terms, Tedros could, for instance, declare that the United States had a public health emergency of gun violence and mandate actions which should be taken. This may seem far-fetched, but it's absolutely within his power as defined by the IHR, and the UN and WHO have long had an initiative of working to reduce gun violence and the damage caused in the United States and other nation states that are perceived to have a problem with guns.
And that's not that far-fetched. We saw the CDC in the United States has already been trying to take that stance, that it's a public health emergency.
Yeah, because it's all harmonized. It's all vertically integrated. So that's where that stands. And we do have a executive branch right now that is totally comfortable in advocating this strategy, which is aligned with the Agenda 2030 at the UN, which also includes the clause that as a fundamental human right, people have the right to migrate to wherever in the world they wish to live, which seems to be the driver behind a lot of the policy decisions about dropping national boundaries, borders, and allowing free immigration across borders, such as our southern border.
Yeah. Like I said, we've seen already the CDC doing that. Now, just for everybody listening, for a little historical, and correct me if you think this is wrong, but it seems like Absolutely. Under the Obama administration, this really kicked into high gear. He went around apologizing to the U.S. everywhere. He's the one that put us into the Paris Accord. He's the one that put us into the WHO. And then he even got the UN involved.
Well, he didn't put us into the WHO. We were already there, but he advanced a lot of new conditions that were aligned with Agenda 2030 for sure.
Then even bringing the UN into the United States to oversee elections and things like that. And then, to your point, Trump pulled us out of the Paris Accord, wanted to cancel funding to the WHO. And then under the next Obama Biden admin, the very first day, it was putting us right back into those things.
Yeah. And Mr. Obama is also the one that has notoriously, repeatedly stated words to the effect that censorship is necessary to preserve democracy. This is a different construction of democracy underpinning this. We don't have a democracy, just to be clear on that. We have a representative government. We don't have direct democracy. But there's a whole school of thought that involves redefining the term democracy and its meaning that is ascribed to by a lot of these globalist groups that's talking more about democracy as akin to social responsibility, like with the ESG scores and the social credit system. The word democracy in those circles that have their roots in utilitarianism, and I argue utilitarian Marxism, are using the term democracy in a different way than most people think of it. But Mr. Obama is clearly has a long history of repeated advocacy in favor of information control and censorship in order to preserve whatever democracy is as he sees it, which is completely antithetical to the Constitution. It's a complete inversion, but consistent with a lot of the other manipulation of words, very Orwellian, that we've seen all the way through the last 3 years.
Yeah, I love that you started with we're not a democracy. The U.S. is a republic. I think part of trying to overturn that is trying to call it a democracy. But to your point, what you would consider a democracy is what the mass wants, what the majority of the people want. And if you don't educate the people, if you don't allow them to find the information, then how can you trust what they vote on? But even more so, if you don't take into consideration what they want, like, the Biden administration basically saying all the conservatives, everybody that voted for Trump is a threat to the democracy. But it's like, if that's what the people want, isn't that the definition of democracy? So what is their
Well, remember, we're also simultaneously in this fifth-gen warfare battlescape. So what people think they want is highly manipulated. It's basically taking advertising technology and putting it on steroids and weaponizing it. The technology for manipulating what you think you want. You crave a McDonald's hamburger, good for your health? Hell no. But you crave it because we have all kinds of technology to teach you that you want fries, a shake, and a McBurger, right? And it's the same. We don't. That's why my point about sovereignty in fifth-gen warfare. What we think we have in terms of free will becomes anachronistic. It's obsolete. We are highly, highly manipulable and manipulated. And there are no ethical boundaries. The government has politicized every single thing. You can see it everywhere. Everything is politicized. Everything is subjected to nudge technology, famously made, advanced in the UK, where all information that you receive, the broadcast that you receive, the Netflix that you look at, we talk about wokeism. What that really represents is that every single thing you encounter or touch or feel or sense or taste is manipulated to an end of a political objective by some group or entity or persons that you have no awareness of who they are. But we've seen from the Twitter files that a large number of Democratic-based operational groups are deeply involved in that. And now we have the deployment of AI, right, which has been actively funded by the U.S. government as another tool of propaganda warfare. And as we're looking at ChatGPT and these other AIs that are being deployed that are going to be, by the way, integrated into all Microsoft products, yay, looking forward to that, they are all biased against conservative points of view. They are just another tool to manipulate our mind and thought, but they're marketed as this independent, objective arbiter of truth, when in fact AI is notorious for what the starting parameters are that you use in launching the program. You can basically get whatever you want out of AI based on how you set up the parameters. It's just another way to fool people.
Just on that note, OpenAI is not open. it's closed, and they feed it whatever they want to, and so there's lots of tests to show how biased it is. Have you seen Stable Diffusion and what they're doing? And it's all open source AI, and they've been able to compress it down into like a 2 gig file where everybody could run their own AI. And they're trying to exactly counter this by giving it OpenAI where everybody could have their own that we build on our own. So it's worth checking out Stable Diffusion. There was a really good interview with Peter Diamandis and the founder of Stable Diffusion, Emad, I forget his last name. Amazing interview. Everyone should check that out.
But this is a great segue, what you just pointed out, to the topic that you were leading into, which is what can you do about it? What can the average person do about it? And what you just gave was a great example of a decentralized future in which you have independent entities creating communities, creating applications, creating capabilities that are autonomous, and often a key here is they have to be decoupled from the cloud. That's another one of the great problems that we're now confronting. Like this studio, for instance, I rely on Starlink commercial for my up and down. And so I'm not going over T-Mobile or some other application, all of which get censored. My servers and all of the other IT infrastructure here is behind a independent firewall, which we're having to upgrade because of all of the attacks that we get coming through that pipe. It's a big pipe. And our IT volunteers, very senior people, because they volunteered because they like what I say, I guess, very kind. But they've never seen this level of attack before. So we're now moving into an environment where everybody has to basically cocoon themselves if they want to have any kind of autonomy or resistance to all this. And we have to live in a decentralized world as much as possible. This is what George Orwell predicted in one of his early forewords to 1984, was that we would all become manipulated through pharmacology into a compliant passive state in a future authoritarian regime of the type that he was envisioning. And that the only way he believed that we could ever avoid that outcome, that eventual outcome, I mean, how prescient is that, that we're all going to end up being manipulated by pharma. The only way that he could see overcoming that is to work really hard to build a decentralized society. And that, I think, is what gets us towards the better future coming. There is a potential in the human species that's different from this dark fourth industrial revolution, transhumanism, singularity, where the idea of Homo sapiens becomes obsolete. And we move into a world of Homo Deus, man is God, and we control our own evolution, and we build ourselves as some kind of a bizarre Terminator fusion of man and machine and chips and surveillance of our brain waves and all these things that the World Economic Forum talks about. We don't have to live there. And I think this is one of the beauties of understanding fifth-gen warfare is at the superficial level, if you take the time to read the articles, download that ebook from Kindle, sorry, it's an Amazon product, and read about, it's actually titled 5GW, and Michael Flynn has it's a super easy reader on fifth-gen warfare. Once you go through that stuff, you'll never be the same. It's like those of us that have grown up with American advertising, we can see right through a lot of the garbage they throw at us. The poor people in Ghana can't. They haven't grown up with it. It's like deploying a nuclear bomb on third world populations, modern marketing technology.
And kids, too.
Yeah, well, absolutely. But if you learn the technology, then you can see through it and you can start to become more resistant. But if you start to work to master it, then you can deploy it yourself. I was lecturing to a group in Stockholm, 1,300 people out on the, in the Radisson on the water, and talking about 5GW in a recent talk. And I made the point that the battle group in Fort Bragg for the U.S. Army that does a lot of this psyops work is 800 soldiers. And there was 1,300 people in the audience. I said, if every one of you decides to be a warrior instead of a victim, we've got them outmanned right away. Okay? The beauty of fifth-gen warfare is if you learn the technology and strategy and you understand this battlescape, you can choose to be a warrior as opposed to a victim. And I think we can be successful. One of the things that is a challenge for all of us right now is what are our objectives? The issue is when you take a bunch of libertarians, they have a tendency not to want to cooperate with each other by definition. And I was speaking with Nigel Farage. He actually kind of coached me a little bit about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and then I saw him again 2 weeks ago. And I asked him about what were the key lessons from Brexit. And he said the problem was we started off as a bunch of libertarians and we had no understanding or idea or interest in cooperating with each other. And what we had to do was define a common set of principles that we all agreed on that wasn't too big, that was forward-looking, positive. And then we had to come up with a name for that. And once we had done that, of course, that name was Brexit, then we were able to coalesce around it and get the job done. His belief is that we're not quite yet there. We don't yet know as a community, a diffuse community, decentralized community, what it is we really want. What is our vision of the future? I think that is our biggest challenge right now, is to come up with a positive vision of the future, a morning in America for the world that's different from this Terminator, Mad Max, Matrix, ugly thing that Yuval Harari and the WEF want to, quote, shape for us, in which we'll eat the bugs and own nothing and be happy and live in some sort of a technocratic workers' utopia in which if they only have enough data on all of us, they can run it through their algorithms and optimize resource distribution for everybody in the world except for them.
Well, I think, I'm a firm believer in individualism. I wrote a book in August, released it in August, called The Uncommunist Manifesto, and it's a counter to...
You're the one behind that. Yes, I've seen that book.
Yep, I'm the one behind it, so appreciate that you've seen it. I'm going to send you a signed copy, so I'll get your info after. But it's a counter to the Communist Manifesto, and obviously we oppose collectivism and I push individualism. But I believe that, individualism, we should always be concerned with ourselves, but we also share in aligned values. So enemy of my enemy is my friend, so to speak, right? And so where we come together and...
But it's a little more than that, isn't it? I mean, we have this Judeo-Christian ethic that's been developed over millennia and time-tested in civilization. And for some reason, we want to throw that away. This gift that's been given to us by generation after generation after generation, whether you believe it was divinely inspired, at a minimum, it represents a time-tested way for humans to live with each other.
Which is why they want to change history. They don't want us to remember how good it was, so we go back to that. They want us to look back in history as something being bad and evil that we don't want to return to. Yeah, it's interesting. So I'm curious, talk about this decentralized future. So that's something that I talk about on my radio show. I call it the decentralized revolution that I believe we're going into. And if you look at this, there's all these centralizing forces that are building up, the WEF and the WHO, and it's all kind of one big thing. And when you look at what's behind the WHO or the
and don't neglect the BIS, right?
Yeah, the BIS, that's at the top, right? So we have the BIS at the very top, and then we kind of have these NGOs kind of in the middle layer. That's kind of the way I see it. But So, okay, so let's talk about the BIS, the Bank of International Settlements sits at the top, the bankers. And they talk about companies that don't go along with this will be, quote, economic roadkill. So they enforce this. You had talked about if they don't go along with it, they would use the WTO, the trade organization, to impose economic sanctions, but they also use the IMF, and they won't give them funding and things like that. So,
And this is what's baked into the ESG score. And what I'm hearing is that with the social part of that, environmental, social, and governance, with the governance score, if the executive of your company is donating to causes that are unapproved, your G score goes down. On your S score, apparently there are rating groups that are circulating that will basically give you the S score that you need. If you don't have a sufficiently high ESG score, you cannot get capital. So for instance, by definition, if you're in the petroleum industry, you cannot have a good ESG score. Therefore, there's no capital available for wildcatting or speculative drilling or oil exploration or development of new processing plants. That all that capital is not available by the very nature of your industry. In terms of the S score, what I'm hearing is that they're acting as little mafias. These rating groups are often populated by people that are within those groups that believe they've been disadvantaged. We could call that LGBTQ. And they will come into your company and say, you will either do these things that we want you to do. You will hire these people that we want you to hire. You will, down to the level of, you will provide free plane tickets so that we can go to protests and rallies across the United States. And if you do that, we'll give you your high S score. And if you don't do that, we'll tank your S score. And it's basically a shakedown. And this is what corporate America is facing right now. And none of this has anything to do with maximizing shareholder return or product quality or any of the other normal metrics in business. It's completely distorting it based on Klaus Schwab's idea of a socially responsible corporate governance structure.
which is why I'm hopeful and optimistic and truly believe that it fails because it doesn't work that way.
But how many lives are destroyed in the interim?
Oh, sure. Sure. It's already happening. But on that thread, and I love the fact that you threw out the BIS and sits at the top. So the BIS and IMF and this economic, right? And so the government, all governments, the United States government continues to grow at this massive scale. They continue to send billions or hundreds of billions of dollars to WHO, and now hundreds of billions getting laundered through Ukraine, getting into the WEF. And so all of this money that we don't have, right? We're spending.
Well, let's call it what it is, fiat currency.
Okay, so you nailed it. I'm setting the table here, but you know, so we have this fiat currency. They're able to print money because we don't have it. It's a deficit spending. Billions or trillions of dollars are going into building a perfect prison, right? Printing money, creating a digital panopticon to build social credit score systems and ESG systems and economic roadkill and all these things. And so back to this decentralized future, then it seems like the key, as one of my favorite economists, F.A. Hayek, said, never be a sound money again until we take the thing from the hands of the government. But it can't be done by force, rather a sly roundabout way, introducing something that can't be stopped. So I'm curious to get your opinion on what you think about the best decentralized money, which is Bitcoin.
Yeah, so this has been one of the bizarre things about this long, strange trip I've been over the last 3 years, is I found myself in Puerto Rico and Miami and at the Bitcoin conference talking to the whales and getting tutored by Brock Pierce and others, and the editor of Bitcoin magazine.
Well, don't listen to him too much.
Potential downside here is that in one fell swoop, the BIS with the governments can make decentralized Bitcoin currency illegal. And the argument that's made by the Bitcoin community is, well, blockchain allows us to tunnel through that and they can never kill it, and they've tried to kill it in the past and they've never succeeded. I hope you're right. I wouldn't put all my eggs in that basket. And, I probably shouldn't even speak about this. We just dropped another 20 in Cougaron. I think that the evidence seems to be that we are heading into, on something of a horizon like a year or less, or maybe a few more, to a major economic event. There's too many vectors that are coming into conjunction, having to do with things like the Social Security system, fund illiquidity, and the BRICS strategies. I mean, all we have to do, and the Saudis are already jabbering about it, is move away from a dollar-pegged petro exchange to something that's pegged to some other vehicle, some other token, to use Bitcoin language. And suddenly we have a huge surplus of dollars washing about in the international economy. And folks will start to unload those dollars, and that is a significant risk for a hyperinflationary environment, which historically I've heard it's been a pleasure to interface with the Bitcoin community because they've taught me so much, but they do have their biases and hopes. But I've heard it floated that the real predicate to major social unrest and rise of totalitarianism historically has been periods of financial instability and hyperinflation in particular. Once you have hyperinflation,
Sure, when you can't feed your family.
everything you thought you knew about the nation state becomes obsolete and irrelevant. The legitimacy of the nation state in a hyperinflationary environment goes to nothing immediately. And then you have anarchy, chaos, revolution, uprising, etc. The strategies here, and I think this is what many people, it's not my, Ernst Wolf talked about this 2 years ago, in which we'll transition from the current fiat currency structure to a central bank digital currency environment in which you have to, in order to implement that, you have to have a digital ID. We have to have the masters of the universe have to have all kinds of information on all of us. They have to be able to control the allocation of this digital currency, and they have to be able to control how we would spend or deploy it, how we would use it, in order to ensure that we have the greatest good for the greatest number, and from each according to his abilities and to each according to his needs. That's where this is all going, and I hear again and again that the coming economic instability that many foresee is going to be the ruse under which CBDP is going to, or central bank digital currency is going to be deployed. Is this aligned with your thinking?
So the central bank digital currencies are just fiat currency, so I don't believe that it's going to solve any of the problems. So to your point, yes, we're heading to an economic cliff. That's going to be a big problem. Switching to a CBDC won't help that because it's still just fiat currency. It will be a tool for surveillance and control, 100%. So it's really bad for us, but it doesn't help the government. We can see this in Nigeria right now. Nigeria has launched their own CBDC. They call it the e-Naira, but everyone had already started using Bitcoin, and the government was trying to incentivize people with discounts to use the CBDC, and the people are like, why would we do that? It's the same Naira that we have now that loses value. It continues to buy less and less goods in the future. So we already have Bitcoin. We're going to stick with Bitcoin. Now they're imposing the stick. So they tried the carrot, now they're trying the stick. So CBDCs don't help the government debt or the financial cliff that we're heading to. It does help the surveillance state. Back to kind of the piece about Bitcoin, though, is I was a speaker at the Bitcoin conference. I'll be speaking there again at the Bitcoin conference. So if you're listening to this, come to the Bitcoin conference and come check it out. And if you want to come back, I'd love to invite you. be careful of what Brock Pierce says because he talks about blockchain and cryptocurrency, which is a big difference. Also, I saw you at the Freedom Fest last year. I was a speaker there. I didn't get to talk to you. I'll be speaking at the Freedom Fest this year too, if you happen to be there. But anyway, I'm a gold bug. I love gold. I still buy gold. I still talk about gold. But the problem is gold doesn't work in a digital age. And so the attack vector is the economic warfare. And so you as a content creator, you need sponsors. You need money to live. And so it's very easy to cut off your payment accounts, your PayPal account, your credit card accounts.
Yeah, that was the reveal in Canada with Justin Trudeau and Christopher Friedland.
Right. And so as a content creator, you could easily set up where you could accept Bitcoin directly through, and that can't be stopped. Now, could they make it illegal? Sure. Just like they've made drugs illegal. And look how well that's worked, right? And so they can certainly try to make things illegal. History shows that making things illegal doesn't really stop them. And when they tell you not to do drugs, it doesn't make you want to do drugs. When they tell you you don't have a right to store your money or transact without the government stealing from you, then it sort of makes you want to do that. So I think they do their own marketing for them. So just in the future of a decentralized world, knowing that the fiat money gives them the source of all their power, and not only is it the source of their power, it's also their weapon. There's a tool that we have to counter that. There's only one. Gold just doesn't work because I can't send you gold right now. So anyway, it's worth keeping an eye on.
No, I think we're aligned that there are a number of challenges in envisioning a decentralized world, in envisioning a world of, let's say, semi-autonomous gulch entities. We could call them intentional communities. That sounds fancier than Gulch. In a decentralized world, which I think is the only way we get to a future that has a snowball's chance in hell of realizing the full potential of the human species, is a networked, decentralized world. And in a sense, we can see the outlines of that and occasionally the glimmer of that potential future for humanity in some of the positive aspects of what's happened on the web from time to time. Particularly before it started to be so corporate controlled. But what I'm wrestling with on a daily basis in this mission of trying to come up with a vision for the future that's positive, and that's part of why that tagline is in the book, is how do we envision a future using a system that has never existed before? And so what I find is when we start talking to folks about this, what does this future look like? We have to have a token-based exchange of some kind because obviously barter is not scalable, as you're just saying about gold. Whether it's gold or grain or other tangibles, it's just not scalable. We have to have some token that we can exchange. I agree that Bitcoin provides the best current solution to that. We also have to have solutions that allow the connectivity between these cells or pods or autonomous communities. And that's a real challenge because there's, then we start talking about Web3 and tunneling capabilities and what could we do because we really can't afford to build a new web. And how do you operate that? And you quickly find yourself in the landscape of where you're going to have some form of censorship. We can all agree that we don't want to have fragments of snuff films stored on our laptops, right? And so we find ourselves right back in the same place that has given rise to our current slice of censorship hell. And I don't know what the answers are. And when I engage with people, I hear things like, oh, we should set up a think tank to solve that problem. And I feel like slamming my head against the wall when I hear that. It's going right back to the same thinking and solutions that have failed us. So I think this is one of our biggest challenges, and the Bitcoin folks are the closest to grappling with a lot of these things. As far as I'm concerned, they're the most free thinkers of the free thinkers that I've encountered. But there's still a bunch of intrinsic problems that we have in moving forward to this. And as far as I'm concerned, what I think I can do is help structure some pathways forward for allowing us to help to work on these issues. But when I hear people that come to me saying, "Oh, I've got the solution," I generally want to run. Over.
Yeah. Well, it's not there's no silver bullet, right? There's lots of solutions that we need for lots of problems that we have. But certainly dealing with the economic weapon, there's a solution for that piece, but it doesn't stop all the other problems, to your point. I think there's some, and I think what you're saying, and I would agree with, it's very difficult when we're in an existing system to imagine a new system. And so what we try to do is we try to think about how can we take what we have and mold and adapt it into this different world, and how does that transition look? But we have to imagine that it's just very difficult to see a new system when we're stuck in one.
So have you ever read the book by Thomas Kuhn called The Structure of Scientific? That's a good one to add to your reading list, given how your mind works.
I have not, but it sounds like a good one.
Thomas Kuhn is the one that gave us the language, Structure of Scientific Revolutions. He's the one that gave us the language of paradigm shifts. And what happens again and again in systems is they become kind of locked into a given solution set that is useful for solving the problems of the day. And then over time, it gets optimized to the point where it has achieved its maximum value within that existing system, and you accumulate more and more and more unsolvable problems, which is basically what you're talking about. And then there needs to be, what will occur at some point in time is truly transformational thinking or innovation. And you will suddenly see this kind of quantum shift or disruption in the entire system. This is why, of course, all the VCs, I'm sure you have touch points with the Silicon Valley, Sand Hill Road community. Well, they're all looking for disruptive technologies, because that's basically saying we're identifying things that will disrupt that structured solution set that currently exists. And when you do that, then you have this huge explosion of new innovation that occurs. And that, I think, is going to be what will happen, but you can't predict when it happens and where it comes from. But you can set up conditions that favor its creation. And that's why I recommend that book, Structure of Scientific Revolutions, to you, is because there are certain characteristics that seem to be predictive of environments in which these disruptive events can occur. And I think that's what the likes of you and I can do, is to try to set the stage to empower and enable this kind of disruptive thinking.
And with problems come solutions, and I'm super bullish on what happens when millions of entrepreneurs' backs are against the wall. So we're starting to see lots of good solutions coming out, and I'm hopeful in that. Man, we've covered a lot of ground. We went way longer than I had intended, and there's still so much we could cover, but we'll have to cut it off at some point. Man, you're a wealth of information. I've enjoyed listening to you. I recommend everyone subscribe to your Substack. We're going to link to that down below, as well as your book, Lies Government Told Me. Anything else that you want to say, kind of to wrap this up or call attention to?
Yeah, I think it's really important to not just be dark. And we just talked about a lot of dark stuff, and people that listen to this are going to want to go out and shoot themselves. You don't have to be a victim. That's the big message here. We have those that have been damaged by various medical procedures, those that have been damaged by various public policies over the last 3 years, those that have been damaged by the information warfare. You can choose to be a victim, or you can choose to be a warrior. And we've talked about ways in which you can become a warrior. You can be empowered. You can fight back. You are not helpless. In this information battleground, if you gain the knowledge of how the game is being played against you, you can become a soldier. You can become a warrior. And absolutely, one of the key parameters in fifth-gen warfare is it's leaderless. It's completely decentralized, which means you can not only be a warrior, you can be a leader. And a decentralized leadership model is absolutely the most effective in asymmetric warfare because the unknown shadow opponents don't know who to hit. One of the problems with me being high profile is I take a hell of a lot of the flack. And the fact checkers were on me like flies because of the profile that I have, which kind of gives cover for everybody else. But the point is that we can all be in this battle. And I think that's the way we can move forward. I think that's the positive vision. That, and as George Orwell said, we need to move forward in a decentralized way to build that decentralized set of solutions so that we don't have to have our children live in this indentured servitude, dark, matrix-like vision, that's somewhere between Mad Max and Terminator. We've all seen those movies. We don't have to have our kids live in that. And I think that's the positive, is we can be empowered, particularly in this information battleground. The challenge is to not become the enemy. And there are those who say they do it to us and so we can do it to them. They lie at us, so we should lie at them. They breach ethical boundaries all the time, and so we should be able to breach ethical boundaries. And I argue that that is the road to hell. That's how we become the enemy. This is a lesson that's been taught in literature, in the Rings trilogy, in everything, again and again and again. So don't do it. Maintain higher standards, respect human dignity, commit yourself to integrity, and build community. Community is the thing that makes us resilient and able to resist all the propaganda and the other garbage that they're throwing at us. Over.
Man, I love it. That's my message. Don't be a victim. It's dark and scary, but it's going to be a fight. It's going to be work, but I believe we win. Amazing. Like I said, we're going to link to everything that you have down below. Man, what a great conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks, Mark. It's been fun.
I appreciate everything that you're doing to continue to spread this message. We're going to keep pounding the table on this. And with that, we'll sign it off. All right, that's a wrap. Hopefully you enjoyed this conversation with Dr. Robert Malone. It might have been my favorite interview I've ever done. He is a wealth of knowledge, and I love his message. I love what he's talking about. It aligns with what I'm trying to do so much. And like he said, we are not victims. We should be warriors. We can rise up, we can push back, and we can fight back in this fifth generation warfare. And you can help by sharing this video with other people. Share it with your friends, your family, coworkers. Share it on social media. Like it so more people see it. And of course, subscribe to this channel so you know when I put more videos out. And that's what I got. Thanks for listening. To your success. I'm out.